Hello and welcome to the Democrine Tech Talk. This time Frank Everaerts and Harm den Dekker, mechatronic system engineers of Democrine Eindhoven, will take you to the world of wearables. They will tell you all about the challenges they foresee for the wearable market. Thank you for watching and enjoy the Tech Talk. Harm, the floor is yours.
So in the next half hour, we will shortly discuss what is wearable. Frank will give a definition and some history. And we will talk about the challenges that we experienced in our own projects. And we will finish with the Democrine's ecosystem for wearable development and also give some other examples of wearables that have been developed. Frank?
Yeah, let's first start with the definition of a wearable. Then for obvious reasons you open the dictionary. And in the dictionary you find that a wearable technology or wearable is any kind of device designed to be worn on the user's body. And a lot of people think that wearables are available now since 10 to 20 years. But that's also the period that the fitness trackers became available and also affordable. But wearables have been on the market for a longer period of time. In fact, already early 16th century, this guy, Peter Henlein, designed and built the first wearable watch. And this system, of course, was used for timekeeping, but also had a chronometer and had an alarm bell integrated. And this is the start of the wearable technology. But over the years, wearables have changed. What you see here on this image is a flight surgeon. He works for the Royal Dutch Air Force, and he's wearing a patch made by TNO Holst. And this patch contains all kinds of sensors. And the intended use is to monitor the performance of a pilot in a plane. Because a plane now has all kinds of registration systems. Everything is monitored, but not the pilot. So this is a little bit towards a fully controlled system. So this is a wearable in 2023. In 1950, this was a wearable. What you see here on this image is Dr. Holter. Dr. Holter is the inventor of the continuous ECG registration for people with potential heart rhythm diseases. And he's wearing a backpack, and this backpack contains an amplifier, contains a transmitter, a tape recorder, and a big heavy lead-acid battery. So the total system has a weight of 30 kilograms, but it was the first wearable that could be used to monitor performance of a patient while moving. And there are images available of patients who were cycling around the hospital and the ECG was measured. But this was in the 50s. In the 70s, the systems became smaller tape recorders became available. And in the 80s, the cassette players were introduced, so the systems became smaller and smaller. And in 2015, TNO Holst came with the first generation of health patches, and that led to the development of the patch you see on the image on the right. So for wearables, a lot of technology comes together. It's about portable power, communication, microelectronics and storage, and this all has years of development behind, technological improvements, and especially to make it smaller and less power hungry. But from the other hand, it's also about expectations. On the middle image, you see an image made from the movie Star Wars. And here one of the actors is wearing a watch. It's in the 60s, and that watch has an integrated TV screen and was used to communicate. The first iPhone became available in 2007. 2010, the iPhone with the front-facing camera. And people think that this is the start of wireless communication in the way it was done already in the 60s. But a lot of people already thought that this was reality for spies or secret agencies who were using this technology. And also you see an image of Kit, Knight Rider, with the driver Michael Knight. And when Michael was in stress or he needed help, he simply took his watch again, called for help, and Kit would drive to him. Well, now it's 2023. we have autonomous driving cars, but it is still very challenging that your car comes to you to rescue you. Technically, it's possible, but there are a lot of other challenges.
Yeah. So maybe it's good to discuss some personal experience in wearables, Frank. I see you brought the Glanum ECG patch. Could you maybe explain a little bit more about the patch you have and what your role in the project was?
Yeah, Glanum is a company that was founded. I'm co-founder of the company. And the reason that we founded is that we came to the conclusion that a lot of nice technology is developed, but is not introduced into the medical market. Especially when you visit the general practitioner, you see still old-fashioned technology. And we developed this system as a minimal viable product. It is an ECG recorder. It replaces the Holter recorder. Holter recorder is still a kind of bulky device, an iPhone size, and to be worn by the patient. It's expensive, so there is a long waiting list. And yeah, what we think is that this system needs to be available in every practice of the GP. And we call it niet plannen, maar plakken. So if you have an potential underlying heart rhythm disease, then within a few days there should be an answer.
Nice.
And on the other image, I see the SmartCare Victor. Harm, what is your role in the project?
Yeah, so SmartCare is a startup located in Eindhoven and in Noordwijk. And they came up with the idea to develop a wearable that can be used by elderly people, for example, to monitor them at home and to see how their vitals are doing. So it's a wearable on the upper arm that can measure pulse rates, oxygen saturation levels, activity, skin temperature, and it has the ability to detect falls. And it transmits that data to a server where a nurse, for example, can look to the vitals of many different patients, and if something goes wrong, they can act on it. So a couple of years ago, SmartCare came to Democrine to assist in the development of the mechanics and electronics. And my role in the project was system developer, so I was responsible for setting up the requirements, the different concepts, and also the testing in the end. You discussed the Glanum ECG monitor, and often the term minimum viable product, so MVP, comes to mind. Could you explain why it's so important to have that minimum viable product?
Yeah, if you design a product, it's, by the way, minimum viable product is one approach of doing business. In this case, it was selected because we focus on the Holter technology, so ECG registration. The patch has more sensors on board, but they are not used at the moment. And the aim is to develop it, to produce it, commercialize it as soon as possible, and then start working on next generation patches. And for this device, it was feasible. For the SmartCare Victor, you mentioned many challenging sensors that have to work together. So maybe you can explain a little bit what was the biggest challenge of this device, in this device.
Yeah, so I prepared some slides to further discuss that. So the biggest challenge I think we faced with the SmartCare Victor was integrating the pulse oxygen measurement in a wearable. So if we take that example, the conventional method is to have contact ECG where you place electrodes on the wrist or on the chest or on the legs, and you measure the electric signal, and from that you can determine the heart rate. Now for a wearable you want it to measure it locally, so typically you refer to pulse plethysmography or photoplethysmography, where you have an LED which transmits lights, and in the example of the finger clip, the light is transmitted through the finger, and on the other side you place a photodiode, and there with every heartbeat blood is pumped into the extremities, and it changes the amount of light that is absorbed. You can also see that in the graph on the lower right. Now, because we wanted to have a proper battery life, we decided to change not to measure it on the finger, but we moved to the wrist at first. But it turned out that the wrist has a lot of motion, so we decided to move to the upper arm, and we did a lot of testing to specialize for the location on the upper arm. Now the main challenge, if you move from the conventional method to the PPG measurement, is that you have this LED and the photodetector. Those are the two minimum sensors or emitters you need. But because you have to make sure that no ambient light reaches the sensors, or if it does, that you're able to detect it, you also have to add optical isolation and an ambient light sensor. I already mentioned that if you have a wrist watch, there's a lot of movement and you want to compensate or know that that movement is present. So you include an inertial measurement unit or a gyroscope. The next challenge is if the temperature of the skin is low, that the perfusion of the skin is less, so you have to emit more light to get the same signal at the photodetector, for example. And you have to combine all these different sensors into an algorithm to determine what output is needed from the LED and how you can use the signal from the photodetector to actually determine the signal that you're looking for. So the main challenge in the wearable is that you have to combine many different sensors to get the same knowledge as you would have for the conventional method. Let's get back to the Glanum ECG monitor. What's the most important lesson you learned from the Glanum ECG monitor?
The most important lesson learned is, well, design for low power with conventional components is challenging. Because in the phase of Glanum, we cannot develop our own integrated circuit for this application. And another challenge was that, and that's also due to the research organizations who already claim that they have patches available for many years now. Mm-hmm. It's challenging to explain to an investor that this is something new, because you often get the remark that it is already on the market, and then they show images, very promising images that were made 5 to 10 years ago.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And well, what is your lesson learned in this project?
Yeah, so for the SmartCare Victor, I think the main lesson learned also refers to the measurement that we discussed. It's very difficult to get good measurements in the lab that actually predict your performance in the field. So with SmartCare, they did many in-house tests and also tests with many different people and in the clinic to actually see how the sensor would perform in real life. Because you can do a lot of measurements in the lab, but the real proof, of course, is if you do it outside and if you have other people experience it.
Yeah, this is one of the challenges in medical device development in general. They are typically tested on healthy young volunteers, often male.
Yeah.
While reduced to practice, the outcome is a little bit different.
Yeah.
But this is a really nice example of an idea that sounds not so complicated, but gave you a lot of engineering challenges.
Yeah, which was a lot of fun, but
yeah.
We love a good challenge.
Sure.
So one of the topics that I would also like to address is what you already touched. You get the remark that the technology is already out there, and you discussed that in the beginning with the watch that Michael Knight is wearing in Knight Rider. So you have an image here of the watch that Michael Knight is wearing, and you have an image of the Apple Watch, but there's, I think, 40 years in between. But people have the idea that it's already there. So in order to develop that wearable device, you have to convince many people that your technology is actually new, and you need to have investments in order to get the technology to the level where you need it to be. So it involves talking to material suppliers, technology suppliers, and also make sure there's a volume market for the patches. And what you typically then come to is the valley of death for the development of medical devices or other applications, where at first you need a lot of research, you need a lot of money to get that technology ready, and then it takes a while to commercialize it before you actually start earning money from your invention. Maybe some examples of wearables, Frank?
Yeah, if you do a search on internet on product concepts, of wearable concepts or patches, you find all kinds of novel ideas, often made by visionaries. But here are 3 examples with a company of research institute behind. On the left-hand side, it's the University of Minnesota. They came with the concept that a patch is printed directly on the skin of the patient. And the story behind is that if you have an underlying disease, you go to a special clinic, you introduce your hand in a machine, and then a custom-made, custom-based system is printed, data is collected, and you get treated, you receive a treatment. The upper right-hand side image is a concept patch made for L'Oreal. In this case, the patch measures the skin pH, and with the app, the system advises you what kind of cream or lotion you should use. L'Oreal also has another concept patch with a light sensor to detect the amount of ultraviolet radiation you received. So the app advises you to use a sunscreen blocker, or stay inside, or go outside if you have not experienced any sunlight at all.
Like the engineers.
Like the engineers who are working on a really complex problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and VTT is the other picture. They are working on flexible electronics, and in this concept they combine flexible electronics with rigid integrated circuits. But there are also some commercial products available on the market. This is an example of a temperature tracking. The TempTrack system, I found it already in the US 10 years ago, an over-the-counter product. At that time, it was promoted as being the best care for your child. If your child is a little bit feverish, you apply the patch and you can monitor the patch, you can monitor the temperature of the child all the time. The question is, of course, if this is really needed. And skin temperature is not the core body temperature, but of course there is a relation between. The patch is still available on the market, and you see it often used in a private clinic as special add-on that patients get wirelessly monitored, and no thermometer is needed anymore. And this is a commercial product called the SenseU, designed and produced in the Netherlands. So that's also very nice. It's a bladder sensor. The system can monitor the fullness of the bladder. And typically, children with urine incontinence use this device for training purposes and also for warning that you really need to see the bathroom. And it's reimbursed by insurance companies, and that's also promising.
Critical step. Yeah.
It's a critical step, yeah, for sure. And then also a commercial product, there is a whole family of glucose monitoring systems. In the Netherlands, there are more than 1 million diabetic people. They have to use the finger prick method to determine the amount of glucose in the blood. And with this system, with a tiny microneedle, it's automatically done, and the data is available 24 hours a day. And Medtronic is one of the companies who designed a closed loop system where the sensor communicates directly with the pump. So it's in fact a closed loop system.
Nice. So I did some research into the reliability of wearables, related also to the intended use, and there are some few findings that I would like to discuss. So the first question is, of course, how accurate is the data from the wearable? We already touched that you need to do a lot of elaborate field testing. And I found an article from 2020 where different fitness trackers were compared, and they were compared on the steps that they indicate and that the user actually took, and also the heart rate that was measured. And you can see that there is a big spread in what is represented by the wearable and what the wearable indicates. And also the challenge is that a lot of data from these fitness trackers is from health fanatics, and that people who are less active have maybe a different lifestyle. And currently a lot of reimbursements from insurances, for example, are coupled to how many steps you take a day. And I found an interesting video where someone attached a wearable to a power drill just to get his 10,000 steps a day in a couple of minutes or hours. So yeah, it's of course challenging to make sure that what your wearable is actually providing you as data is related to what you want to wear. And another article that I found is related to the Apple Watch, which introduced ECG monitoring. And you can make an ECG recording on your Apple Watch, and based on that, the watch gives you advice on whether or not to visit a cardiologist. And in the USA, they contacted a lot of cardiologists, and it turned out that only in 10% of the visits, the visit actually resulted in a diagnosed underlying cardiac issue. So in 90% of the cases, the visit to the cardiologist was not actually needed.
Yeah, I spoke to many general practitioners in the past, and they all came with that same remark. First of all, with a wearable, how accurate is the data? There are a lot of people who come to see the GP and nothing is wrong, but the device suggested that the person needs to visit the GP. And also the GP has no clue who collected the data. And I think that movie that was just shown is a nice indication of someone else or a system who's collecting data. And then you go to the GP and maybe a wrong treatment will start.
Yeah, and especially, of course, since the underlying algorithms of the wearables are most often unknown, and also the output can be quite vague. So you get a sleep score after you have a good or a bad night of sleep, but also a stress level is indicated with a number, but it is very unclear, of course, to what that number means.
Yesterday my watch gave me a stress level of 10%, but I still don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, that's also a good question.
Yeah.
So another example where we found some interesting data that we would like to discuss is the Philips Health Dot. It's a heart rate and breathing rate monitor that can be applied to the chest, and it uses the LoRa network to transmit that data back to the hospital, even if patients are already at home. And one article looked into the reliability of that sensor for post-bariatric recovery. And I think one of the interesting topics is that even for this wearable, the data pre-processing is very important. And it also turned out that 34% in this study was excluded because of low quality, which is, of course, very difficult to predict upfront. And if we look at the 5-minute averages that were provided by the sensor, 90% of all data falls within 5 breaths or respiratory beats or breaths per minute. And the big question, of course, is as a developer, I want my system to be accurate to the final digit. But what's relevant for the clinic? And that's very important to determine in the early phase. In the graphs, you can see, in the middle graph, you can see that sometimes the health dot doubles the monitor value. And it's for this type of cases that you need to answer, do you have to fix this if you want to launch the product, or is it accepted by the user group? So those are very important questions, of course, to address. And also, what's the use case of the wearable? So we found a baby monitor sock with this PPG sensor that we discussed earlier. It has 16 hours of battery life, and it takes 9 minutes to charge. And the idea is that you can put it on the foot of your newborn, and you can monitor how they're doing if you're sitting on the couch. But it also states in the manual that it's not a medical device. So it's not used for patient monitoring. It's mainly used for unburdening the parents or technology geeks. But it's very important to get this very clear if you want to launch your products.
We have seen that they did a clinical study, but they tested it on adults. So yeah, that's far from newborn babies, but for obvious reasons they can't test it. But the question is, how reliable is the data? That's also not sure.
No, and it's always difficult to determine what the clinical trial should be to actually validate your product.
So some important considerations for wearables, and we touched already quite some in the presentation. It's the data accuracy. When is good enough? If a person is recovering, maybe to measure the breathing rate and the temperature 4 times or 5 times a day is sufficient. And what is then the benefit of using the technology versus existing devices? For sure, with an automated device, a patient can't forget it. The data maybe is a little bit more accurate because patients typically make mistakes when doing certain measurements. But there are also a lot of secondary questions to consider. What is the goal of the continuous data collection, and is this needed? Is there a need to explain the underlying algorithm? And who is the end user? Is it the patient, is it the care provider, or is it the insurance company? And then it becomes a little bit tricky. And of course, the business model, if you are an engineer, sometimes that is less important. But if you have a company or you are the person, the organization who wants to have a system developed, it's extremely important.
So that brings us to the last chapter of our talk. Let's look further into the Democrine ecosystem and some wearables that were developed. So Democrine has an ecosystem that's split up into 7 different sections. We start with the feasibility phase, where we look at what technology is needed to launch your wearable. And if needed, we bring in a proof of principle, where we investigate certain aspects of the wearable. Now, if all the feasibility aspects have been tackled, we move on to the product definition. We start with a list of requirements. We create a concept, and we can already start investigations into human factors, for example. Then you have a first alpha design phase and an alpha testing phase, phase 3 and 4, where we go into the detailed design and we start a realization of the first products. And those products can typically already be used for the first clinical trials and also to get data from usability studies, for example. Now that brings us to the next phase, the beta, where you incorporate those findings. You might have to make some adjustment based on test house findings. And you start a bigger series because you want to do production you want to test your production processes and make sure your product can be assembled correctly.
So basically, it's a one-stop shop approach that Democrine can offer.
That's the idea. You can come to Democrine during the early phases, and you can leave Democrine with a production-ready CE-marked product.
Nice.
Now let's look at some examples that have been developed at Democrine.
Yeah, this is an example. This is called the Legally Med Ring. It's a drug-device combo. It's a vaginal ring. It contains electronics. It contains a micro pump and also microfluidics. And it's basically a platform concept also for enhanced systems in the future. And Democrine's contribution is system design, the whole microfluidic development, and also the pilot manufacturing takes place at Democrine at the moment.
Nice. Another example is Johan Sports, which is a sports tracker that's worn on the chest and can be used in many different sports. And here you have an example of a soccer player. And the idea is that you can track the person throughout a match. You can monitor their heart rate, their physique, and also their positions. So during the match, you have real-time data. After the match, you can have physical analysis of the individual players. And after several matches, you can also use it to have tactical training data. And what Democrine did here is optimize the system, and they are also currently focusing on manufacturability and manufacturing several devices.
Okay, and then the final example is the Maccabi SEMG system. It's a system that monitors the diaphragm contraction that can be used for ventilator assistance. This is an example of a real challenging project because you need to measure the muscle EMG in an area where also the heart is beating. There's a lot of filtering and introduced, but this is really toward a smart ventilator system. And Democrine's contribution is development and testing.
Thank you for your attention. We hope you enjoyed our talk about wearables, and please stay tuned for the next episode.